Vaheguru, 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 Vaheguru.
Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Thank you everyone for joining us today for our last, third and final Sikh Heritage Month event focused on kids. This event, we're going to be focusing on the history of Sikhs in Canada, and we hope that everyone will be able to learn many new things today. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the Q&A box, and we will address them at the end. So today's presentation is Sikhs in Canada, which is a Sikh Heritage Month Ottawa presentation. So first of all, I guess if you look at the slide right now, you can see 4 names and people on the right side. And many of you might be wondering, what does Charles Metcalf, Sir Robert Bort, Sir Johnny Mcdonald, and Dileep have to do with Sikhs in Canada? And let me tell you that this is where the connection between Sikhi and Canada starts. So if we look at the first name on the list, we have Charles Metcalf. For some of you who may know, Metcalf Street is the street that runs right up to Parliament Hill in Ottawa, Canada. It's also the name of a village outside of Ottawa. And what if I was to tell you right now that the person who this is named after, so Sir Charles Metcalf, used to be the Governor General of Canada and is married to a Sikh woman from Maharaja Ranjit Singh's court. Yeah, so Charles Metcalf, whose street runs right up to Parliament, is married to a Sikh person from the Lahore Darbar. Charles Metcalf was also in charge of signing the treaty with Maharaja Ranjit Singh in 1809, which set up the borders of the Sikh Empire and the British India. So now you might be so surprised that this is a connection between a Governor General of Canada, before Canada was even a country, in the Sikh Empire. The next person on the list is Sir Robert Peale. He was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And now you might be like, so what does Sir Robert Peale, a UK Prime Minister, have to do with Canada and Sikhi? So first of all, as many of you may know, the Peel region is this vast region outside of Toronto, which consists of Brampton, Mississauga, and Caledon. So this is a region of Canada. But Peale is also the person who initiated the Anglo-Sikh Wars in the 1840s. And this is what resulted in the fall of the Sikh Empire. Next up, so Delhi and Lucknow. Many of you may know these as cities in India, Delhi being the capital and Lucknow being another very important city in India. Now the connection to what does this have to do with Canada? Well, 2 names here. So Herbert Reed and William Hall. Both of these are 2 of the first recipients of the Victoria Cross, which is the highest honor you can get in the military in Canada. Both of them were soldiers who fought in the Indian Mutiny, and they fought alongside Sikhs while they were serving out in India. And finally, Sir Johnny Mcdonald. As many of you know, he's our first Prime Minister. And when Canada became a country in 1867, Sir Johnny Mcdonald wrote a letter to one of his friends in India. And as you can see on the left side, it's what his letter said. It said, "War will come someday between England and the United States, and India can do us human service by sending an army of Sikhs across the Pacific to San Francisco and holding the beautiful and immortal city with the surrounding California as security for Montreal and Canada." This is what Sir Johnny Mcdonald, the first Canadian Prime Minister, wrote to his friend in India. He was asking for an army of Sikhs to come and help Canada whenever the Americans invaded. So that is just a small taste of the connection between Canada and Sikhi. So as you can see on this next slide, for any of you who are curious, Delhi and Lucknow are also cities in Ontario. So the Canadians were so proud of the 2 Victoria Crosses they earned in India fighting alongside the Sikhs that they named 2 cities here in Canada after Delhi and Lucknow. And finally, on the left side, you can see this poster made by the Sikh Heritage Museum of Canada, which shows this amazing coincidence of history when in 1867, the first Prime Minister of Canada was asking for an army of Sikhs. And then 150 years later, the Army of Canada was led by a Sikh. And so now we're going to get into today's conversation. So we're going to start all the way back at the start when the first Sikhs came to Canada, and we will progress throughout the time to modern day. So the first Sikh in Canada was in 1888, and this was Prince Albert J. Dileep Singh. So this is the son of Maharaja Dileep Singh, who was the son of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. So this is the grandson of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, who was known to found the Sikh Empire. So that was the first Sikh who ever came to Canada. So Prince Albert J. Dileep Singh, he came as a military aide to the Governor General of Canada and like the Army Commander of British North America. He lived for 2 years in Halifax, and the building you see here is the location where his house used to be. His house was actually torn down in 2017 for a refurbishing, but this was the exact location where Dileep Singh's son stayed in Canada. So this was the first ever record of a Sikh being in Canada. So now you can think of to yourselves that there's a direct connection between Maharaja Ranjit Singh's Sikh kingdom in India, and Canada as a country. So then early in the 1900s, many Sikhs started to move into Canada. So a lot of this initial migration was soldiers who had seen Canada during tours of duty, because many Sikhs, as they were going from India to England for different celebrations, they would travel through Canada and they saw this beautiful land where they could settle and do farming and other such resources. So the first Sikhs that started to come into Alberta was in the city around Frank and Calgary, Alberta, and this was in 1903. So Alberta became a province in 1905. So Sikhs have been a part of Alberta from before before Alberta was even a province. And so many of these early Sikhs actually ended up becoming more westernized. So they ended up cutting their hair and ended up looking more American and dressing in American ways and taking up American names so that they could get better job opportunities. But there are still lots of accounts and old photos of Sikhs working around Alberta. So now, as you can see, as Sikh migration in 1904, so this is the title of a paper in Vancouver, and all it says is "Turban Men Excite Interest." So this is a showcasing of how when Sikhs were coming in the 1900s, there was a lot of interest to see who these new people were coming to Canada, as at that time, Canada was a land of immigrants from all over the world. And then finally, in 1908, this was when the first Gurdwara was made in Vancouver. This is the Second Avenue Gurdwara. So this is no longer actually standing, as it was destroyed in the 70s to build a future bigger Gurdwara. But this was the first ever Gurdwara built in Canada and one of the first in North America. So after about a decade of lots of Sikh immigration into Canada, in 1908, the immigration rules were changed by the Canadian government, who was fearful of these Asian immigrants into Canada. So one of the biggest rules they made is that now the head tax on new immigrants into Canada increased from $25 for any European settlers to $200 for Indian and Sikh settlers. So $200 in those days comes out to about $4,000 today. So imagine having to pay $4,000 just to come and be allowed into Canada. That doesn't include your boat trip or your boat and your train and your living expenses in Canada. It's $4,000 just to be allowed into Canada. So that really prevented a lot of Sikhs from showing up. And another rule that changed was that now Sikhs could no longer stop on the way to Canada. So you had to, if you got on a boat in India, you could not stop anywhere on the way to Canada. And as many of you know, the Pacific Ocean is in between India and Canada, and that's a very big trip. So you can't make that trip in those days without stopping anywhere. So that pretty much prevented any new Sikhs from coming into Canada. And finally, also in 1907, as another way of stopping more Sikhs from coming to Canada, Sikhs lost the right to vote in Canada and could no longer be citizens. So this also resulted in a lot of Sikhs in the next coming decades leaving Canada and moving to the United States. So as many of you may wonder, like, what were the jobs that Sikh Canadians did when they first came to Canada? So one of the main jobs that Sikh Canadians did was they worked on the Canadian Pacific Railway. So as many of you know, Canada is connected by a railway going all the way from the East Coast to the West Coast. So many Sikhs worked on this railway, especially in the parts around the Rocky Mountains. Many Sikhs also worked in lumber mills, and this included even creating their own lumber companies. So Sikhs came to Canada and started their own companies and even made their own cities. So the city of Paldi in British Columbia is actually a city founded by Sikhs, where it was mostly Sikh and Japanese workers who worked around a lumber mill. And finally, Sikhs also worked in different mines throughout BC. And also the Sikhs even created one of the first companies in Canada, which was the Guru Nanak Mining and Trust Company, which was founded in 1909. So as you can see, Sikhs had a very strong foundation in Canada throughout, from the start of Canada all the way into the mid-1900s. So finally, now we're in the 1910s. So in 1910s, the first Gurdwara that is still standing in Canada was built. So this was the Gersik temple in Abbotsford, BC. So this is the only temple that's still standing, and it is the only Gurdwara outside of South Asia that has been made a national historic landmark. This is how old and important it is to Canadian heritage that the Canadian government made it a historical landmark. And finally, in 1912, so up until 1912, all the Sikhs in Canada were Sikhs who had recently migrated from India. But in 1912, the first Sikh was born in Canada. So as many of you, as young people growing up in Canada, many of you were probably born in Canada. So to imagine that 100 years before you were born, there was a Sikh that was born in Canada. This was the first Sikh that was born in Canada. So he was born in 1912, August 28th, and this was Hardayal Singh Atwal. And finally, 1914 was the first time Sikhs finally made it to Ontario. So we're right now in Ottawa, so that's in Ontario as well. So before 1914, all Sikhs were mostly in the Western provinces, so BC and Alberta. And then finally, 1914, Sikhs came to Ontario. And finally, in 1914, we also had the Kamagata Maru incident, which we'll be discussing on the next slide. So the Kamagata Maru was this boat filled with all these Punjabi immigrants that were trying to come to Canada. And what they had done was this Gurjit Singh Sandhu, who is a businessman in India, and he decided to hire this boat, the Kamagata Maru. And they packed it full with 376 passengers, and they were all trying to come to Vancouver. So once they got to Vancouver, they hoped that they'd be let into the country and this would fix the immigration rules in Canada, make Canada more open to more immigrants and more people coming in from India to come and move to Canada for a better life. But unfortunately, what happened is when they arrived in BC, they weren't allowed to deboard and the ship was blocked from entering Canada. And they were forced to stay out in the ocean for a while before finally being forced out by the Canadian Navy to go back to India. So this resulted in all of these passengers, many of whom had put a lot of money into coming to Canada, not being able to actually come to Canada and being forced back to India. So in apology of this incident, in 2014, the Canadian government actually made a special stamp that you can see here. This is the Lions of the Sea stamp. It represents the Kamagata Maru incident, and there's also memorials throughout BC commemorating the Kamagata Maru and apologizing for the injustice that happened back then. Okay, and then now we're into World War I. So as many of you may know, 1914 was also the start of World War I. And we might think that, oh, Sikhs came to Canada. And at this point, like I mentioned before, Sikhs weren't even allowed to vote. So they weren't even considered citizens of Canada. And so you might wonder, why would Sikhs go fight for a country that they weren't citizens in? But as Sikhs, as we all know, we are warriors, and we decided to go defend our new nation and hope to help improve Canada and the world. And so as you can see, there are many Sikhs who went to fight in the World War. There are approximately about a dozen Sikhs that went to fight in the First World War as representatives of Canada. But the three ones that we know the most about are Private Gurban Singh, Private Gujar Singh, and Private Lashman Singh. So as you can see, the Private Gurban Singh, he actually came to Ontario. He came to Ontario when he was 14 years old. And then at 22, he decided to join the First World War as a Canadian soldier. So he was actually wounded twice in battle, and it is said that he was actually treated by Dr. John Mccrae, who many of you may know was the person who wrote the In Flanders Field poem. So if you think about it, this poem about Flanders Field, which is very important to all Remembrance Day celebrations, has a connection back to Sikhi and Sikh Canadians as well. And so after being injured twice on the battlefield, Private Gurban Singh was actually eventually sent back to Canada to get better. And unfortunately, he passed away in 1919 from tuberculosis that he contracted in the battlefield. And he is actually the only Sikh Canadian soldier from World War I who is buried in Canada. And you can see his gravestone in the bottom left corner. So it has the maple leaf and it has his battalion number. And that is, I believe it is in Kitchener. It's in the Kitchener Military Cemetery. And then in commemoration of Private Gurban Singh, they've also named the public school after him. So another Canadian who fought in the First World War was Private Gujar Singh, and his grave is actually in Belgium, and I'll show you that to you on the next slide. But Private Gujar Singh signed up in Montreal, and he was actually a battle at the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915. So this was a major battle for Canadian national identity, and there were Sikh Canadians at this battle to help build the Canadian country. And so one of the unique things about his grave is that, as you'll see on the next slide, his grave doesn't actually contain the maple leaf that you see on Private Gurban Singh's grave, but instead it has Punjabi scripture on it, which says God is one and victory to God. And finally, we have Private Lashman Singh, who died in France, and his memorial is actually this statue you see right here, which was erected in the city of Bling in France, and he actually has Singh Lake in Canada named after him. So we named a lake after Private Lashman Singh and to commemorate his sacrifice. And finally, if some of you may recall, but if you look at the name at the bottom, we have Lester B. Pearson, who was a Nobel Prize laureate and a Canadian Prime Minister. And now the question comes up, so what does Lester B. Pearson have to do with Sikh Canadians and Sikh soldiers? Well, what if I told you that Lester B. Pearson's friend in World War I was fellow pilot Sardar Hardeep Singh Malik, who was the Indian High Commissioner to Canada. And both of them fought under Canadian William Barker. So once again, a Canadian Prime Minister and a Sikh come together in history. And this just shows how interconnected Canadian history is with the history of Sikh Canadians. And so this is Private Gujar Singh's memorial in France. So as you can see, it says Ekamkar Shri Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh at the top. So it has Punjabi scripture instead of having the normal maple leaf that other Canadian graves would have. So this kind of showcases how people recognize that Sikhs and Sikh Canadians were a special identity, and that we were given our own privileges in the battlefield. So now we're kind of entering into the mid-1900s. So this is after World War II, And this is kind of where Sikh Canadians and the success that Sikh Canadians saw in Canada kind of started to increase. And this all started first in 1947 when Sikh Canadians finally got the vote back. So this was 40 years after losing the vote in 1907. So now Sikh Canadians could become citizens and could start voting again. So this kind of opened up the pathway to more Sikhs coming into Canada, as now we had more rights and we were able to act as citizens in Canada. And then only 3 years later, the first Sikh was actually elected to any official office. So this was Niranjan Singh Garewal, who was elected to be a city councillor in BC. And then finally in 1968, so as you may recall, the first Sikhs came to Ontario in 1914. So approximately 50 years after coming to Ontario, they were able to finally open their first Gurdwara in Ontario, which is this 269 Pape Avenue in Toronto. As it is still standing, you can see the picture right here. And then finally, in 1985, we had Willie Opal, who was actually the son of one of the first Sikh pioneers to Canada. He was elected to be on the Supreme Court of British Columbia. So this kind of shows you the full cycle of these first Sikhs coming to Canada and having to struggle against all of these laws and these immigration bills. And then finally, just a generation later, one of the sons of these early Sikhs was able to be on the Supreme Court of British Columbia. And then finally, on this left side, on the right side, you can see this newspaper article, which says the newest boat people. And this is a representation of, in 1987, what happened is 174 Sikhs were dropped off the coast of Nova Scotia, off this little fishing village of Charlesville. So this village had only about 30 homes. And what happened is that one night, in the middle of the night, a bunch of Sikhs were dropped off by this boat that was helping smuggle them into Canada. And they were dropped off the coast of Nova Scotia. And they all kind of walked into this village very lost because they didn't know where they were. So what happened was these Sikhs were told by the people who helped them come to Canada that they would take them to Toronto. And then when they got dropped off in Halifax, all the way on the other side of Canada, they asked all of these villagers of, can we get a taxi to Toronto? So these people were just dropped off anywhere. And as Canadians, we worked together and helped them. And so the first interaction they had with Canadians was being fed biscuits and tea when they came to Canada in the middle of the night, in a village that was thousands of kilometers away from where they thought they were. So that's just an interesting story of how Canada and even Sikh Canadians are connected to even the history of these very small and remote villages throughout Canada. The Sikhs have been everywhere in Canada, and we're just interconnected with Canadian history. And so the next slide we'll be discussing. So now what we did is, the first couple of slides was more of a timeline, and now we're going to kind of separate different aspects of Canadian and Sikh history, and we're going to discuss them kind of one by one. So the first part we're going to discuss is law enforcement. So the first achievement for Sikhs and in law enforcement was in 1986, when the Toronto Metropolitan Police allowed Sikhs with turbans to be a part of the force. So this was the first police force in Canada and one of the first in North America to allow Sikhs with turbans to be a part of the police force. And then the biggest challenge to Sikhs in law enforcement came in 1991, when Baltej Singh Dhillon, he came to Canada as a young child from Malaysia, and he worked with the RCMP as an interpreter for a while, and then eventually he decided he wanted to also join the RCMP as an officer. And what happened is he came in and he did the training and he passed all the training, but he was told that the RCMP wouldn't allow beards and turbans in the police force because that didn't fit the uniform guidelines. So now here was Baltej Dhillon, who was trying to serve our nation, being stopped because he was adhering to his faith. And what happened in the end was a lot of Canadians pushed back against actually letting Baltej Dhillon into the RCMP because they said that it would ruin the iconic RCMP uniform. But in the end, the Canadian Supreme Court and the Canadian government helped pass laws that allowed Dhillon to complete his training and join the RCMP, and has made the turban and the beard a part of the RCMP uniform. And then finally, our last major point to discuss today is that Ajit Paul Kaur Tawana was the first RCMP woman, or first Sikh woman in the RCMP. So the next aspect we're going to discuss is education. So as we know, the first Sikhs kind of came to Canada in the early 1900s, but for a long time, they only were allowed to work in like lumber mills and mines, in like these hard labor jobs, and weren't allowed to actually get an education. So the first Sikh to actually get an education and to graduate from university was in 1924. So that's about 3 decades after the first Sikhs came to Canada. And this was Nahar Singh Mangat from UBC. So he graduated from UBC. And then it took another 25 years before female Sikhs were allowed to graduate from the medical field. So this was Dr. Jagdish and Dr. Sarjeet Sidhu, who were the first women to graduate from medical school in Canada, first Sikh woman to graduate from medical school. And they were both born to pioneer families. They were also born to these original families that came in the early 1900s to Canada. And finally, as you can see, the statue on the left side, this is Dr. Niranjan Singh Dalla. He was an Order of Canada recipient in 1997 and has been inducted in the Canadian Medical Hall of Fame. So he is a very strong member of the Canadian medical community, and he was actually one of the speakers at one of our earlier events this year. So you can always go check out his lecture at SHM Ottawa, the YouTube channel. But he was one of the most influential Manitobans of all time and has his statue placed outside of Manitoba City Hall. So this just shows that within 100 years, Sikhs went from not being allowed to get an education in Canada to being one of Canada's most important cardiologists. And so no discussion of Sikhi in Canada can be complete without discussing the Karpan and all of the cases and the Supreme Court cases that focused around the Karpan. So the first issue of the Karpan kind of coming into the public highlight was in 1987 when Sukhdev Singh Handal was prevented from going to school in Peale region. So the Peale region is once again named after Sir Robert Peale, who we discussed at the start of this presentation. So as you can see, all of these things kind of come in full circle and are all connected to each other. But so initially he was banned from wearing the Karpan at school, but this was eventually overturned by the Ontario Supreme Court. And then in 2006, this was when the main Karpan case in Canada happened. So this happened between Gurban Singh, who was a 13-year-old who went to school in the École Sainte Catherine Labeur in Quebec. And this case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And in the end, what happened was that initially Gurban Singh was prevented from going to school by wearing a Karpan because it was said that it was a danger and that it shouldn't be allowed in school property. But the Supreme Court eventually overturned this ruling and declared that it was a violation of freedom of religion. And as many of you know, Canada's constitution protects freedom of religion. So in the end, Gurban Singh was actually allowed to go back to school with a Karpan. And this was the landmark case that helped ensure that Karpans could be worn by students everywhere in Canada and not have to worry about not being a part of their faith. Okay, so one of the biggest things that Sikhs have been a part of in Canada has always been politics. There's been success in politics right from the start. As we mentioned earlier, the first Sikh elected into office was in 1950, just 3 years after Sikhs got the vote. And from then on, over the past 50 years, there's been a lot of firsts among Sikh politicians. So we'll just kind of go over some of them right now. So the first Sikh to be elected to provincial parliament was Manmohan Singh, or Mo Sihota. He was elected in 1986 for the BC NDP party, and he actually served as a Minister of Labor in the BC party. And so right now, he is also the president of the BC NDP. So this was in 1986. So it took about 30 years from the election of the first Sikh in a local election to the first Sikh in a provincial election. And this was followed in 1988 by Dr. Gulzar Singh Chima, who was a doctor and a member of provincial parliament in both Manitoba and British Columbia. So he was initially elected in Manitoba from 1988 to 1993, and then he moved to British Columbia, and he was elected again in British Columbia from 2001 to 2004. And while he was an MLA in British Columbia, he served as the Minister of Health and the Minister of Immigration and Multiculturalism. So as you can see, within a couple decades of getting the vote, Sikh Canadians were already getting involved in politics at all levels. And this finally accumulated in 1993 when not one, but 2 Sikhs were elected as MPs to the Canadian federal parliament. So this included Gurban Singh Mahal from Pamela Rai Malton and Harbans Singh Harb Dhaliwal from Vancouver. So Harbans Singh actually ended up becoming the first Sikh cabinet minister as well, as he was made the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans and the Ministry of Natural Resources. And then finally, the first Sikh woman to be elected to any level of government was in 1996 when Satinder Kaur Hawkins was elected to the British BC provincial government. And then finally, this all accumulated in 2000 when Ujjal Dosanjh was the first Sikh to be elected as premier of any province. And he eventually served as premier for a year before serving in the federal cabinet as Minister of Health. And then finally, in 2011, we had 2 Sikh ministers elected to federal cabinet at the same time. So this included Tim Uppal as Minister of Democratic Reform and Baljit Gosal as Minister of Sport. And then finally, as many of you may remember, 2015 was a massive year for Sikhs in politics, as for the first time, there were 17 Sikh MPs elected to federal politics and 4 Sikh ministers. So as you can see, the ministers' photos right here. So we have Navdeep Bains, who was the Innovation, Science, and Economic Development Minister, we have Harjit Sajjan, who was the Minister of National Defense, and whose photo was seen at the start of the presentation in the poster with Sir Johnny Mcdonald. And then we have Amarjit Sohi, who was the Minister of Small Businesses and Tourism. And we have Bardish Chaggar, who was the Minister of, I believe it was Small Businesses. And then she was also elected as the first female leader of the government in House of Commons. She was the first female to ever be in charge of running the House of Commons. And then finally, Sikhs finally reached the last stage, last house of Canadian politics, when Sarbjit Singh Marwa in 2016 was elected to be a part of the Senate. So now we have a Sikh senator as well. And then, as many of you may know, in 2017, Jagmeet Singh became the first Sikh to be in charge of a national party outside of India. So this was a very big deal for Sikhs, as this showed that Sikhs in about 50 years had gone from just being a part of a city councillor all the way to in charge of a national political party. And now we're going to talk about sports. So Sikhs, as well as politics, Sikhs have had a lot of success in sports in Canada, winning Olympic medals, representing Canada at the international stage. So Sikhs have always been a part of Canadian sports. So the first kind of recall of Sikh athletes in Canada was in 1971, when Tiger Jeet Singh, who was a wrestler, came to Canada and he sold out the Maple Leaf Gardens. So if any of you have watched hockey, that is the stadium that the Toronto Maple Leafs play in. So he sold that out for a wrestling match and as a Sikh, that was a very big accomplishment, especially in the 1970s when Sikhs weren't such big numbers in Canada. And then finally, in 1976, this was the first time Sikh Canadians represented Canada at the Olympic stage, and this was in field hockey with Sarbjit Singh Dosanjh, Paul Bubli Singh Chauhan, and Kuldeep Singh Gosal all being a part of Canada's field hockey team to the 1976 Olympics. So in actuality, Canada actually would have had a Sikh athlete in the 1964 Olympics, because Harinder Jeet Singh Rai was actually the first Indo-Canadian to qualify for the Olympic Games. So he also helped Canada qualify for the field hockey games. He was actually the one who scored the winning goal that got Canada to the Olympics. But then a few months before the Olympics, he was kicked off the team by the Canadian Olympic Association. So unfortunately, Canada didn't get their first Sikh athlete in 1964 and instead had to wait till 1976. But to connect to Harinder Rai's story, we have Pamela Rai, which is actually his daughter. So she was actually the first Sikh Canadian to win an Olympic medal. So she won the bronze medal in the 1984 Olympics, and she actually commemorated it to her dad, who was unfortunately not able to play in the Olympics because of rules back then. And then finally, we have the first Sikh Canadian to join the NHL, which was Robin Bawa, he joined the Washington Capitals in 1989. And then over his 12-year career, he played for different teams like the Vancouver Canucks, the San Jose Sharks, and the Mighty Ducks of Anaheim. So he played for many different teams in the NHL. And then, so the first Sikh to actually get drafted into the CFL was Bobby Singh. So he was the first Sikh football player in Canada, and he's actually the only player in the world who's won the Grey Cup, the Super Bowl, and the XFL championship. So that's a very good record for a Sikh Canadian in a sport that not many Sikhs play. And finally, as we can see in the middle, we have Pradeep Nagra. So Pradeep Nagra was actually the amateur flyweight boxing champion of Ontario, and he was allowed to compete in Ontario with his beard. But then when he went to the nationals, he was actually told that he couldn't compete with his beard, and he had to cut his beard to quit the competition. So Pradeep Nagra, instead, what he did is he worked hard to fight a court case to allow for him to fight with a beard in the national boxing ring. And eventually, he actually had a movie named after him. So the movie Tiger is based off of his life and his struggles to become a professional boxer. And then as you can see here, we have Jinder Mahal, who is also another Sikh Canadian, and he won the WWE championship in wrestling. And then finally, one of our more recent successes as Sikh Canadian athletes is Gursimran Singh Puller, who was the first Sikh to be drafted into the NBA, and he played for the Sacramento Kings. And finally, just as we kind of start wrapping up this presentation, we're going to be discussing kind of Sikhs in popular culture and TV in Canada. And so there's going to be some interesting facts here that I feel like many of you haven't actually heard of before. So the first thing that actually surprised me the most while I was preparing this presentation was that Satwant Singh was actually a member of a 1960s Canadian band called the Poppy Family. And this band was actually featured as the first top band in Canada and the top 10 in the US for a few of their songs. So this was a Sikh in the 1960s being a part of this popular band back in those days. And then, as many of you know in the middle, so in 1977, the Canadian government actually funded the creation of a film around the life of Gurban Singh Bains. So he was a young Sikh Canadian farmer who grew up in Canada, and this film was meant to help spread awareness of the growing Sikh community in British Columbia and discuss what it means to be a Sikh. So this was back in 1977 when Sikhs kind of first hit the Canadian television screen. And then, as many of you may know or may have watched, so in 2008, we launched Hockey Night in Canada in Punjabi. So this was a broadcast of the popular Hockey Night in Canada, but this was finally in Punjabi to cater to a Punjabi audience. And this was started by Parminder Singh and Harnarayan Singh in 2008. And then, if any of you watched Dragons Den, so that's the show where all of these people come and pitch these new ideas. In 2015, we actually had a Sikh Canadian be one of the dragons, so one of the people who's in charge of the show. And that was Majit Kaur Manas. And she runs a successful business on the side herself. And then she eventually also became a part of this very important and very popular Canadian TV show. And finally, in the final photo on the right side, you can see in 2016, Jaswinder Singh Bains, or Jedzi B, as many of you may know him, became the first Sikh Canadian to be inducted in the BC Hall of Fame. And he even has a star on Granville Street's Walk of Fame. So this features many famous Canadian artists and celebrities. And now we have a Sikh Canadian there as well. And then at the end of this presentation, just as we were wrapping up, there's a couple other Sikh Canadians. There's hundreds and thousands of stories of Sikh Canadians that we could have talked about today, and that each picture and each person we mentioned today has we could do a presentation on all of them, but we just didn't have the time. And for time's sake, we have to kind of give a quick summary on all of Sikh Canadian history, which in itself could be a multi-day lecture. But just to wrap it up, we're going to kind of mention a couple more famous Sikhs that we kind of wanted to discuss and just didn't have time to fit them in anywhere else in the presentation. So the first person on the left here, we have Suneet Singh Tully. So he's actually in the Guinness World Book of Records as creating the largest fax machine ever, and has been voted one of the top 15 education innovators in the world. So Suneet Tully was actually the founder of a company that created these handheld printers and scanners, and is currently working to create the most affordable tablet that he can pass on to young kids who are growing up in conditions where they don't have access to the internet and computers. Next to Suneet Tully, we have Gurban Singh Patia, and he is actually an Order of Canada member. So Order of Canada is the highest honor that a civilian in Canada can get, and he received it for the work he did in helping support multiculturalism in Canada. So he came to Canada at a young age, and after that he worked hard and to spread the awareness of multiculturalism and Sikhi in Canada. And for that, he was eventually given a spot as a citizenship judge in Alberta, and then eventually was awarded the Order of Canada. And beside Mr. Bhatia, we have Justice Balbinder Kaur Shergill. So she was the first Sikh woman who wore a turban to be appointed to any court in Canada. So she is currently serving on the BC Supreme Court. And she's actually one of the lawyers who helped fight the Supreme Court case for the Karpan that we talked about earlier. So she was involved in many Sikh and other religious minorities, and she helped defend them throughout Canada all the way to the Supreme Court. And finally, the last person we'd like to mention today is Manmeet Singh Puller. So he was an Alberta MLA who did a lot of community service and has always been actively involved in the community. And he actually unfortunately passed away while he was helping someone on the highway to help them fix their car. And so he was a great example of how Seva is something that you can do for your whole life, and you don't stop doing Seva just when times get tough. And right now, Manmeet Singh Puller actually has a school named after him, as well as a park. And he's also a charity under his name, the Manmeet Singh Puller Foundation, is actually working to help Afghan Sikhs come to Canada. And that's one of the charities we were working with this year to help raise funds for Afghan Sikhs. And finally, just kind of sets the end up today and wrap everything up. And we're going to talk about how Sikhs are celebrated in Canada. So as you saw, Sikhs came to Canada, the first Sikh in Canada, 1888. That is over 150 years ago. And so this is, in that time, Sikhs have had a lot of impact on Canada and are celebrated by the Canadian government and by Canadians as a whole in many different ways. So the first thing you can see on the right is in 1999, the Canadian government created this commemorative stamp to celebrate Sikh Canadians and the impact the Sikh Canadians had over the last century in Canada. In 2015, Sikh Heritage Month was made in Ontario. So that's what we're celebrating today. We're celebrating Sikh Heritage Month in Ottawa. But Sikh Heritage Month was legislated in Ontario in 2015. And then in 2019, the federal government followed up with their own legislation of Sikh Heritage Month across Canada. And then on this photo here, you can see the Sikh Heritage Museum of Canada, which was founded in 2014. So this was a very important museum and a very important stepping stone for Canadian heritage. And a lot of the research that we're presenting here today actually comes from the Sikh Heritage Museum of Canada. So I recommend you guys check out their website. And if you're ever down in Toronto, you can also check out their museum, as they have a lot of resources on the history of Sikh Canadians. And finally, another celebration of Sikhi that you may have seen throughout Canada is our annual Nagar Kirtans across Canada. So initially, the first Nagar Kirtan actually happened in 1908 when Sikhs opened the first Gurdwara in BC. But then for about the next 60 years, Nagar Kirtans didn't really happen throughout Canada until the 1970s and 80s when Nagar Kirtans once again started popping up across Canada. And now they're kind of a yearly event that happened across the country. And with that, I want to thank everyone for taking the time to listen to our presentation today. I hope everyone learned many new things. Just a couple of reminders. So we are going to do a little Kahoot game now to kind of see who has like what everyone learned and if you guys remember anything. And at the end, there will be a prize for the winner. And also on our website, shmottawa.com, there is a kids game package that you can print out, and there's lots of coloring pages and lots of activities for you to have fun with that are related to Sikhi and Sikh Heritage Month. And with that, I believe we'll take some questions first, and then we'll do the Kahoot. So I saw there were a bunch of questions coming in. Okay, so the first question I have here is, so why did Sikhs only settle in the West and not in the East? So a main reason for this would most likely have to be the fact that it is much easier to go from India to the east coast, the west coast of Canada, so Vancouver, because that's just a single boat ride through the Pacific Ocean, versus having to go all the way around Africa and stopping in Europe and then heading over to Canada the other way around, which is a much longer journey. It was much more expensive, and you definitely have to stop over in European countries who weren't as receptive to having Indian migrants and Sikhs passing through. That's the main reason for that trip. So why did Sir Johnny Mcdonald want Sikh soldiers? So the explanation here behind this is that Sir Johnny Mcdonald, so 1867 is when Canada was formed. So in the 1857 Indian Mutiny, Sikh soldiers actually fought with the British to defend British India, and they'd also fought against the British in the 1840s for the Anglo-Sikh War. So these wars had made Sikhs have a reputation throughout the British Empire as these strong warriors that are always willing to fight till the end. And Sir Johnny Mcdonald knew this, and that's why when the time came for Canada to become an independent country, he realized that America was a very big nation to the south of us that could take us over at any moment. And so he had written this letter in hopes of kind of garnering support in India. So in case war ever happened, the Indian army with Sikhs would come over to America and Canada and help defend Canada. So did Sikhs face discrimination in the early 1900s? So Sikhs, at the earliest stages of the 1900s, before Sikhs were actually completely kind of blocked from coming into Canada, Sikhs did come to Canada, and they were given opportunities to work as they were a strong labor force that many people in British Columbia needed. So many of the actual business people in British Columbia liked having these Sikh and other Asian migrants come to Canada because they provided a labor source for hard work in the British interior, because that was when business was booming and there weren't enough Canadians to fill all those jobs. But Canadian politicians were very against having Sikhs in Canada because they thought that Sikhs and other Indians would kind of eventually take over Canada, and that was the worry there. But the discrimination really kind of kicked off after Canada passed these bills that prevented Sikhs from migrating to Canada in great numbers. So this kind of resulted in the pool of Sikhs in Canada kind of diminishing, and which made it much easier to target Sikhs in Canada. And there were actually many cases in Vancouver, especially, of these riots happening against Sikhs and Chinese and Japanese immigrants. So it wasn't the nicest of times, but there were many Sikhs who were able to start their families and start a good life in Canada. And we still have those families here at this stage. So the next one is, how did Sikhs get the right to vote? So this is not, I'm not 100% sure about this, but as I recall, that there was a lot of push by Sikhs, especially in Vancouver, which was the center of Sikhs at that time, to get more rights in Canada, especially following World War I and World War II, where Canadian Sikhs served in the Canadian military, even though they weren't citizens. So one of the things that I forgot to mention during the presentation is that originally Sikh women and children were banned from coming to Canada, even when Sikh men were allowed. But what happened is, after World War I, Sir Robert Borden, the Canadian Prime Minister, was actually pressured by the other British colonies to show that the fact that Sikhs helped defend the British Empire during this time of greatest need, and here it was a British colony, Canada, not letting Sikhs come in. So he was actually put pressure on by the British in the United Kingdom and other colonies to help bring Sikhs to Canada. And so there were definitely protests, and there was definitely a lot of pushback from Canadian Sikhs and collective bargaining on their end to get these votes. But a lot of it also had to do with the fact that Canadian Sikhs had shown that they were Canadians and were willing to fight for Canada in the wars. Who do you think is the most influential of these Sikhs that you mentioned? I think that Sikhs, everyone had their role to play in Canada's foundation. As each of them built off of the person who came before them, and each of them kind of opened up a new path. So without people who started playing sports, there wouldn't be like other athletes, Sikh athletes kind of pushing into the sports field, or without the first politician to get elected, the other ones wouldn't have like the fact that they could kind of jump off and move on from there. In my opinion, I think I'm gonna have to go with probably one of the kind of like the first Sikhs who came to Canada. So in those initial immigration waves that came in like early 1900, because these were the Sikhs who set up the foundations of Canada, and of not only Canada, but of the Sikh community in Canada. And it's on their hard work and effort that the future Sikh populations and communities in Canada kind of grew. And one of the amazing things you'll learn as you read into Sikh Canadian history is that the original communities, even if they didn't have much to provide, whenever a new community of Sikh Canadians came, they helped them out by providing them with food and with funding and with shelter. So even though everyone didn't always have a lot, they still helped each other out and helped grow the Sikh community in Canada. And then finally, so we have, do Sikhs still face the same type of discrimination in Canada? So I would say that originally most of the discrimination was around the fact that Sikhs weren't allowed to come to Canada or weren't allowed to work in Canada, and there were like certain jobs they could do and certain, so that type of discrimination is definitely has decreased a lot, and in many places is not as prevalent. But there's definitely other forms of discrimination that still exist throughout Canada, especially with like the passing of Bill 21 in Quebec and other kind of aspects. So there's always a next hurdle that we as Sikhs can come together and overtake. And I think what this presentation really shows us is that in the old days, when it was even harsher and it was harder for us to kind of get together and celebrate our heritage, we were still able to overcome all of these barriers. So I think this shows that no matter what barriers kind of come in front of us as a community, we're always able to work together and overcome all of them. And with that, I will set up the Zoom. No, sorry, not the Zoom. I'll stop sharing my screen and start sharing a Kahoot game. And so what everyone can do is you can log on to Kahoot. You can Google Kahoot on your phone or on your computer, and you can just play along with what we see on our screen. So let me just set that up. Share screen, Kahoot, share sound, share. Snapeball, can you confirm you can see my screen? Everyone, as you can see, there's a code up on the screen, and you can kind of just join from that code. We'll get started. Right, let's see. So we'll give it another 2 minutes and then we'll kind of get started. There seems to be a couple of people who can still join in. We have 18 people. Okay, we'll give it another 60 seconds. So all of these questions are going to be based on facts and people we discussed in today's presentation. And so you don't have to have any prior knowledge to compete. And there will be a prize at the end, so stay around for that. And I think we will get started with that. So there's 19 people, and I believe the code will still show in the bottom corner once the game starts. So if you haven't joined yet, you can always join once we're in. Let's start game. So Sikhs in Canada. So the first question is, who asked for an army of Sikhs? So we have Sir Johnny Mcdonald, Sir Robert Peale, Charles Metcalf, or Justin Trudeau. So pick the answer you guys think is the most appropriate for this question. Yeah, so the answer was Sir Johnny Mcdonald. As you can remember, that was on the poster that we showed at the start of the presentation, where it was Sir Johnny Mcdonald writing to his friend in India asking for Sikhs to come and help defend Canada. So right now we have, yep, Nishan at the top. Okay, question number 2. So who was the first Sikh to live in Canada? So we have Maharaja Ranjit Singh, Jagmeet Singh, Prince Albert J. Dileep Singh, or Private Buckham Singh. So who was the first person? So we showed his house in Nova Scotia at the start of the presentation, for those of you who remember. Yeah, so the answer was Prince Victor Albert J. Dileep Singh. So he was the grandson of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, and he came to Canada in 1888. All right, look at that. So we have a lot of people moving up and down the leaderboard. So number 3. So what was the name of the lumber town founded by Sikhs in British Columbia? So we have Toronto, Vancouver, Baldy, or Metcalf. So this was one of the examples we gave as how Sikhs, when they initially came to Vancouver and British Columbia, how they worked hard to make their own cities and their own living. So kind of going into the question of, was there discrimination in the early 1900s? So one of the ways that Sikhs and other immigrants kind of avoided discrimination was kind of setting up their own communities where they all worked together, and so they could avoid some of the bigger cities. But yeah, so the answer was Paldi, British Columbia. So what actually happened is the Paldi was eventually abandoned by most of the community there because it was a very small town. And what eventually happened is they tried to tear down the Gurdwara there, but one of the people we mentioned in our presentation, so Willie Opal, who was the son of an early pioneer, actually helped defend that Gurdwara to make sure it didn't get destroyed. Okay, so we have a new person at the top. So question 4. So which is the oldest standing Gurdwara in Canada still? This is a Gurdwara that still exists and is still used. So we have 2nd Avenue in Vancouver, Guru Sikh Temple in Abbotsford, 269 Cape Avenue in Toronto, and then we have the Ottawa Gurdwara. Yeah, so the answer was the Guru Sikh Temple in Abbotsford. So this is the oldest standing Gurdwara in Canada, and it is a National Historic Site in Canada still. So the 2nd Avenue Gurdwara in Vancouver was actually torn down in the 1970s. All right, so we have some switch in the leaderboard. So question 5. So what city did the Kamagata Maru try to reach? So was it Vancouver, Toronto, Ottawa, or Abbotsford? So this was a ship that was not allowed to dock in Canada in 1914. So the answer was Vancouver. So this was a ship coming from India. It started sailing around Kolkata and it stopped on the way in China and Japan before making its way to Canada. And it was tried to get to Vancouver, but was denied entry. Okay, so question 6. So which Sikh soldier did John Mccrae treat? So was it Timupal? Was it Private Buckham Singh? Was it Hardyal Singh Atwal? Or was it Gurdeep Singh Bains? This was one of the Sikh soldiers who fought in World War I, and he was treated by John Mccrae. And the answer, so the answer was Private Buckham Singh, and his memorial is in Kitchener, Ontario right now. Okay, so that is the leaderboard. So we have a lot of movement going around in the top 5. So it's a true or false question. So does Private Gujar Singh's grave have a maple leaf on it? So this was the photo that we showed on one of our slides. So does it have the maple leaf or does it have Punjabi written on it? Oh, the answer was false here. So Private Gujar Singh was the one that we showed on the slide, which had Ekam Kar Shri Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh on it. So it was some of the other graves actually do have maple leaves, but this is the one that doesn't have a maple leaf on it. Okay, question 8. So in what province is the town of Charlesville located? So this is where this ship dropped off these 174 Sikhs. It was mentioned. So yes, this was a ship that was left off the Sikhs close to a small little fishing village in what province? So was it Ontario, Quebec, British Columbia, or Nova Scotia? And yeah, so the answer was Nova Scotia. This was one of the first instances of Sikhs using boats to kind of come to the east coast of Canada. Okay, so we still have Kaur at the top. Okay, so why was Baltej Dillon originally not allowed to join the RCMP? Was it because he had a beard and turban, he wasn't fast enough, he didn't like the color red, or he was too tall? So the answer was he had a beard and a turban. And so eventually the RCMP did change the rule to allow him to be a part of the RCMP. So now anyone with a beard and a turban can join the RCMP as an officer. So question 10. So who was the first Sikh woman RCMP officer? Was it Dr. Sarjeet Sidhu, Pradesh Chaggar, Ajit Paul Kaur Tiwana, or Pamela Rai? So the answer was Ajit Paul Kaur Tiwana, and she was actually one of the first Sikh women to be in any law enforcement across Canada. Okay, so we had some movement in the top 5. Okay, so which Canadian doctor was added to the Canadian Medical Hall of Fame? So was this Dr. Naranjan Singh Dalla, was it Ujjal Dosanjh, was it Sarjeet Singh Marwa, or Dr. Sarjeet Sidhu? So it was Dr. Naranjan Singh Dalla, and he was added in 2019, so just recently, and he was actually one of our speakers this year at our TIG Talks for Sikh Heritage Month. Okay, so question 12. So who was the first Sikh MLA? So this is the first Sikh to be elected to any provincial parliament across Canada. So was it Nadeep Bains, was it Tigerjeet Singh, was it Pradeep Nagra, or was it Manmohan Singh Sahota? First person we talked about in our politics section of the presentation today. So it was Manmohan Singh Mo Sahota. So he was the first Sikh member of any provincial parliament elected. So we had a switch at the top. Okay, so how many Sikh cabinet ministers were there in 2015? So was there 1, 3, 4, or 10? So we listed out all 4 of their names earlier today. So how many were there? So this is 2015. Four more seconds. And yeah, so the answer was 4. So we had Nadeep Bains, we had Harjit Sajjan, we had Sohi, and we had Pradesh Chaggar. So those were the 4 Sikh ministers elected in 2015. Question 14. So who was the first Sikh Canadian to win an Olympic medal? So was it Jinder Mahal, Gursimran Singh Puller, Pamela Rai, or Sarjeet Singh Dosanjh? So who won the first medal as a Sikh Canadian? Yeah, so it's Pamela Rai. So she won it in the 4x100 swimming relay. And so she dedicated her medal to her father, who was unfortunately not allowed to compete in the Olympics. And okay, so we have, I believe, 3 more questions, and so there's still time to move around. So what was Satnam Singh's band called? So was it the Poppy Family, was it RDB, was it U2, or was it AC/DC? This was the first Sikh Canadian to be a part of a Western pop band. Yeah, so it was the Poppy Family. And so we are heading, oh, there's still a lot of people moving around. So there's a very close to the top. So there's still 2 questions left, everyone. So 16, so who was the first turban Sikh woman appointed as a judge in Canada? So was it Saneet Singh Tully, Majit Singh Manas, Satinder Kaur Sindhi Hawkins, or Balbinder Kaur Shergill? So she was appointed as a judge just recently, actually, in the British Columbia Supreme Court. Yeah, so it was Balbinder Kaur Shergill, and she was actually one of the lawyers who defended the Karpan case earlier in 2006. And finally, the last question is actually double the points. So anyone can take these questions and move to the top right now. And the last question is, so double the points, and it is, in what year was the stamp to celebrate Sikh Canadians released? Was it 1908, 1999, 2017, or 2021? Is it double the points? is 1999. So it wasn't 2017 was the 150th anniversary of Canada, but the commemorative stamp that we showed was in 1999. And finally, so the podium. So we have in third place, we have Baj. In second place, we have Bentley. And then in first place, we have Kara. So whoever came in first, so if you would like, we do have a prize for you. So what you can do is you can either email us at info@shmottawa.com, or you can just send us a message right now over Zoom to the panelists, and we'll make sure you get your prize. But otherwise, unless someone has any, we're willing to take a couple more questions if someone wants to ask them in the Q&A panel. Otherwise, thank you everyone for being a part of Sikh Heritage Month 2021. And otherwise, yeah, thank you everyone.